There's a woman named Ava Holland, and she has written about the concept of fear. And as part of her journey in overcoming fear, she had a great fear of heights. Anyone have a fear of heights here today? Now, I believe that fear of heights, it's not like all or nothing. I think that all of us have a fear of height. It just starts at different heights. There's a height when all of us would be afraid. Anyway, so she had this great fear of heights, and in her pursuit to intentionally overcome her fear of heights, Ava decided that she was going to go ice climbing in British Columbia, where you scale the side of a giant ice mountain. So she recruited 2 experienced climbers to embark on this endeavor with her, and she said that in addition to being her guides, they had to put up with her saying, "I don't want to do this. Please let me go back. I'm quitting. I'm going home. I'm not going up the side of the mountain." But her guides gave her the gentle nudges, gave her the encouragement to keep going. Sometimes we need those people in our lives, right? People who will gently push us on, who will give us the encouragement when we feel like giving up. And so eventually they get her up on the side of the cliff, and it starts to go really well. And she's climbing up the side of the ice, and she says, "I was really enjoying myself. I even would use the word fun to describe climbing the side of this giant sheet of ice." So it was all going very well until it didn't go very well, because when you get to the top, when you're climbing, what do you have to do to get back down? The climbers in the house know that you have to rappel to get back down. As she's rappelling back down the ice mountain, something happens where she comes crashing into the mountain with much more velocity than you're supposed to, and she's got all the picks and axes that you use to climb ice, and as she crashes into the ice, that all impacts her body, and she ends up with bruises all over her body from hitting the ice so hard. And she said, "At that point, I wasn't having fun anymore." What happened the next day, this group wasn't even ice climbing anymore, but to get to where they were going, they had to cross a frozen creek where there was flat pieces of ice across the creek, and they had to simply step from one flat piece of ice to the next. And the flat pieces of ice were only about 1 foot to 1.5 feet apart from each other. But she says because of what had happened the day before, as she stood at the edge of the creek, she was paralyzed with fear, unable to even take one step over a gap of water that was 1 foot to 1.5 feet. Paralyzed with fear. She couldn't do it. It took her friends coming alongside of her once again to even take one step across that frozen creek. Maybe we don't have that story, but a lot of us would have a story where we would say, past pain has the potential to hold us back in the present. Past pain has the potential to hold us back in the present. And so today, this is where we are reaching the finish line in our message series, Overcomer. And what we've said for the last few weeks is to overcome is to prevail over a struggle that otherwise has the potential to leave us defeated. And fear, anxiety have the potential to leave us defeated. So we're talking about overcoming fear today. Our theme verse for this message series is 1 John 5:4. For everyone who has been born of God, that's every person who is a follower of Jesus, overcomes the world. That means all the problems in this world, the temptation, the struggle, the suffering, the loneliness, and today the fear and anxiety. Everyone, maybe you think it's not for me. Well, that's not what John says. Everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world. Our hard work, our positive attitude. No, John writes, our faith. This is the victory. Our faith is the victory that overcomes the world. As we've been talking about this, we've been looking at different events in the life of Joseph from the pages of Genesis in the Old Testament, and how Joseph lived the life of an overcomer. And so today, as we talk about overcoming fear and anxiety are similar words, but they're a little bit different. Just to explain it briefly, fear is the reaction that we get when we are immediately confronted with a danger or a threat or something scary, something overwhelming. Fear is what occurs in that immediacy. Anxiety is more of a state of mind that occurs over time when we live in constant worry, constant anxiousness about things that could happen. Fear is very specific, related to what is in front of us in the moment. Anxiety has to do with more vague possibilities of the terrible things that we think might happen. So when we talk about overcoming fear, when we talk about overcoming anxiety, what kind of fear are we talking about overcoming? Because if we think about it, there's actually some fear that I hope that we would never overcome. Like, for example, if we are standing in front of a busy street, it is fear that says, don't step into oncoming traffic. That's a fear that I never want to overcome. I always want to be afraid of oncoming traffic. If we're standing in front of a stove and the stove is on and the little rings are bright red, it's fear that says, don't put your hand on the stove. That's a fear that I never want to overcome. I'm going to have faith over fear and I'm going to put my hand on that stove. No, we're not. That's a healthy fear. So what fear are we talking about? Also, when we talk about the fear that the Lord wants us to overcome, I don't believe that He is primarily most interested in leading us to overcome fear of high adventure sports. We talked about ice climbing, but I don't believe that God is most concerned about whether or not we go ice climbing or skydiving or rock climbing or downhill mountain biking. So what are the fears that the Lord is most interested in leading us to overcome? Is it possible that the fears that the Lord is most interested in leading us to overcome are the fears that cause us to doubt God's goodness? Think about this. Is it possible that the fears that the Lord is most interested in leading us to overcome are the fears that are cultivated that cause us to resist God's plan, God's promises, and God's purposes? Let me illustrate it this way. You see, we believe that there is an enemy of our soul who wants to keep humanity from God and from God's purposes. And so wouldn't it be logical that that enemy would want to create fear around what God calls good? If you're here as a guest, if you're on the outside of Christianity looking in, you're exploring all of this, we're glad that you're here. Would you give me, if that's you today, would you give me a moment to just talk to the Christians? I want to just talk to the Christians for a second. I have some questions for those of us today who would say that we are followers of Christ, and these are questions that are just as much for me as they might be for anyone who is in this room. God has wired us to love Him and to love people. But my question for us today, do you fear that if you love others, you'll end up hurt? Because maybe you've loved before and you've ended up hurt before, so now do you live with the fear that if you step out in love again that you'll end up hurt? And so you live with a heart that is now closed to deep relationships. God has a plan for marriage. Do you fear that it will be impossible for you to find a spouse if you honor God's plan for marriage and intimacy? God is in control. But how much do we live in fear of what could happen or what might happen? So we try to control everything and everybody, and we drive everybody around us nuts because we're trying to control everything ourselves instead of trusting that God is in control. When Jesus says your heavenly Father knows what you need before you even ask, do we tell ourselves, oh, that must be for somebody else? It doesn't actually apply to me, so we live in a constant fear over our finances. Proverbs 31:8 says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. How often do we hold back in speaking up for causes like life in the womb out of fear of what other people might say? Acts chapter 4, early Christians pray for boldness in preaching God's word. When we think about boldness today, how often do we hold back in calling sin what it is because we fear what other people will say more than we fear God? How often do we settle for a lukewarm faith because we fear standing out? How many times have we missed an opportunity to tell someone about Jesus or invite someone with us to church because we fear rejection? Is it possible that we are settling for less than God's plan for our life because fear of the unknown overpowers the comfort of the known? Jesus, he modeled going to people who were broken, people who were messed up, people who were pushed to the sidelines of culture. Remember, Jesus went to the sinners who the religious people didn't want anything to do with. How often do we hold short of getting involved because we fear that it will get too messy? Once again, we believe there is an enemy of our soul, and wouldn't it be just like the enemy to try to cultivate fear around what God calls good? Wouldn't it be like the enemy to try to cultivate fear around God's plan, God's purposes, and God's promises? Now, if you are on the outside of following Jesus looking in, maybe you have never made a decision to follow Jesus. Maybe you once made a decision to follow Jesus, but if you were to look at your life today, there's very little evidence of a life following Jesus. I want to share this with you. I came to follow Christ. I became a Christian about a year after I graduated from college. And I want to tell you that something that I wrestled with at that season in my life, it was a fear. It was a fear as an outsider looking into faith. You see, my fear was I thought that I was having so much fun in all the sin that I was involved in that I feared that if I became a follower of Christ, that I would have to give up all these things as I stepped into the rules of being a Christian. Now, God woke me up spiritually, and I realized that Christianity is grounded in following Jesus, not following a set of rules. And years later, I would put it into words this way. My FOMO got flipped. My FOMO got flipped. You see, I had sin FOMO, fearing that I wasn't going to be able to sin like I was sinning if I became a follower of Christ. I had a fear of missing out on sin, but God woke me up. And all of a sudden, I developed a fear of missing out on what God had for my life. I feared missing out on the eternity that God promises through his son, Jesus Christ. And so my sin FOMO was quickly put to death by my FOMO of missing out on what the Lord had for me. There's a fear that holds us back from God's plans, God's purposes, and God's promises. Let's talk about overcoming that fear. And what we've already said is what has the great potential to build unhealthy fear, unhealthy anxiety in our present is our pain from the past. So today I want to look at the pages of history in the Bible, and I want to show you how fear that was created by pain from the past almost caused one of the most well-known people in all of world history to miss out on God's plan for provision that was far greater than this man could have ever calculated on his own. And also, fear that came from pain in the past almost caused this man to miss out on God's plan to restore his family in a way that he thought was impossible. Let's look at this. For the last 3 weeks, we've talked about overcoming through the life of Joseph. Quick summary, remember Joseph is number 11 in the birth order of 12 sons, but he is number 1 in his father Jacob's heart. Jacob's other sons, Joseph's brothers, are very jealous, so they plot to kill Joseph. And right before they kill Joseph, an opportunity comes along where they decide not to kill him, but to sell Joseph as a slave instead. Jacob believes that Joseph is mauled to death by a wild animal, so even though Joseph is alive, Jacob believes that his son is dead, and he mourns him deeply. Meantime, in Egypt, Joseph rises to influence in the home of Potiphar, a wealthy, powerful military leader in Egypt. It's all going well for Joseph in Potiphar's house until he's falsely accused of sexual assault, and then Joseph is thrown in prison. But God remains with Joseph even in prison. And Joseph is given favor by God and by the prison warden to the point where he actually is put in charge of the other prisoners. While he is in prison, he is called up out of his prison cell by Pharaoh, the most powerful person in Egypt, the king, the ruler, because Pharaoh has been having some nightmares. And Pharaoh is desperate for anybody who can explain the bad dreams that he has been having. And the inmate who is there with Joseph says, "Oh, he interpreted my dream. I think maybe he could interpret your dream." So they bring Joseph up out of the prison cell. They shave him. They put him in some nice clothes. They put him in front of the king. And the king says, this is my dream. This is the dream that is keeping me up at night. I dreamed about 7 fat cows and then 7 skinny cows. And I can't sleep because I'm thinking about the fat cows and the skinny cows. Joseph, what do the fat cows and skinny cows mean? No one else has been able to give the Pharaoh, the king, an answer. And many of you know the story. Joseph says, well, this is what your dream means. The 7 fat cows represent 7 years of plenty in agriculture and farming. You will have 7 years of so much bounty. We have some of the finest farmers in Oregon who are part of the People's Church family. Thank God, right, farmers? For years of plenty, years of bounty, when there's over and above what you thought that you might bring in your yield this year. So Joseph tells Pharaoh, you're going to have 7 years where there's going to be so much that you're not even going to be able to eat it all or consume it all. So this is what you need to do during that time. You actually need to build barns and storehouses, because the 7 skinny cows mean that you're going to have 7 years of famine, and you're going to need all of the abundance from the first 7 years to get you through the second 7 years. Well, Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph and his ability to interpret these dreams that he elevates Joseph up out of prison, and Joseph becomes the second most powerful person, a foreigner. Joseph becomes the second most powerful person in the nation of Egypt. Well, 7 years of plenty happen, then the famine begins. The famine strikes Egypt, and it also strikes Canaan, where Joseph is from. So Joseph's father, Jacob, and Joseph's brothers and the whole family, they are now in famine. And they've forgotten about Joseph, but they are very hungry. So the father, Jacob, decides that he's now going to send 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain. They're out of food, but they have money, so they decide Jacob decides that he's going to send 10 sons to Egypt to buy food. 12 sons to start with. They believe Joseph is dead. 10 go, there's 1 left. Genesis 42:4. Jacob would not let Joseph's younger brother Benjamin go with them. Here's the word fear. For fear that some harm might come to him. Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that Benjamin might not come back. Quick flashback to understand why. Jacob has 12 sons, but they are with 4 different women. So here are all of the women, and here are all the wives. We've said it before. There are examples of polygamy in the Bible, but that does not mean that the Bible endorses polygamy. In fact, when the Bible shares events from history where one man had multiple women, multiple wives, that man usually has a lot of problems. So the Bible is far more of a warning against polygamy than it is ever an endorsement of polygamy. So there's these 4 women who give Jacob 12 sons, and of all of the relationships, Rachel is really the one who Jacob loves, and he doesn't make any attempt to hide it. Rachel is his favorite wife. Rachel is the love of his life. So Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel, and Benjamin is the secondborn. And what makes this extra painful, what happens to Rachel while she is giving birth to Benjamin? She dies in childbirth. Genesis 35:18, Rachel was about to die, but with her last breath, she named the baby Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. The baby's father, that's Jacob, however, called him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. So with Rachel's dying breath, she says, the name of this child is going to remind you of this painful moment forever. But before the nurse can write it down on the birth certificate, Jacob says, no, his name is going to be Benjamin. We're not going to declare pain over our family every time we say his name. We're going to give him a name that means that he's included, that he is part of the family. Decades later, Jacob believes, because he thinks that Joseph is dead, that Benjamin is the last living link that he has to his beloved Rachel. Joseph, when he had been sold into slavery, it would cause great pain to Jacob. Genesis 37:35. Jacob's family all tried to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. I will go to my grave mourning for my son, he would say, and then he would weep. So Jacob has concluded Joseph is gone, Rachel is gone, life is not worth living, all I have left is Benjamin. We have already said that what has great potential to build unhealthy fear and anxiety in our present is pain from the past. Benjamin is not the first, nor will he be the last child in history to be held back by his parents because of some pain that his parents experienced. And maybe you would say that it is your life story, that someone like a parent or maybe someone else in your life, they have tried to hold you back from what God has for you, not because of pain in your past, but because of pain in their past. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone who's here among us today. And if we were to go below all the layers, we might even admit that we have held our children back because of pain that's happened in our life. Scott Bader Say, he wrote a book called Following Jesus in a Culture of Fear, subtitled Choosing Trust Over Safety in an Anxious Age. And on the topic of fear in a parent's life that holds them back from releasing their children, he says this: the problem with these fears, it's not that they lack any basis in reality, but that we can become so overwhelmed by unlikely dangers that our parenting energy goes into avoiding threats rather than seeking healthy growth. And come on, parents, we need the Lord's help, because it is not a black and white journey when to protect, when to release. We need the Lord's help to guide us in parenting as we protect our kids, but also raise up our kids to release them at the right time so that they can thrive on their own without us. So back to the focus of today. Jacob is wrestling with, and he keeps rejecting the idea of sending Benjamin. So 10 brothers go to Egypt, but only 9 come back. What happens? They get to Egypt. Joseph, he sees all of his brothers. He immediately recognizes them as his brothers, but they don't recognize him. So he decides, I'm going to use this moment to have a little fun with my brothers. And he's further throwing them off by pretending that he doesn't understand the language that they're speaking. He's speaking through an interpreter. He's pretending he doesn't understand what they're saying, but he understands every word. Maybe you speak more than one language, and you've had the pleasure of doing that, where someone doesn't think that you understand what they're saying, but then you understand everything that they're saying. That's what's going on here. So Joseph, he sees the brothers and he counts them, and he realizes that Benjamin is missing. And Benjamin, remember, these are all half-brothers, except for Benjamin, who is his full brother, and so he doesn't see Benjamin. And so he presses the brothers, and they finally admit, there's one who's not here with us. And so Joseph says, I want you to bring the brother who you left behind. And as a way to ensure this is going to happen, one of you is going to stay here. So Joseph puts his half-brother Simeon in prison. And he says, when you bring Benjamin back, your younger brother, he doesn't name him, when you bring your younger brother back, you can have Simeon back. So they go back to Canaan. The brothers tell their dad about the demand to return with Benjamin. Genesis 42:36, Jacob exclaims, you are robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you want to take Benjamin too. Can anyone relate to this next statement? Everything is going against me. Do you have days that feel like that? Weeks that feel like that? Maybe even longer, months, or years, where it just feels, Lord, why is everything going against me? What Jacob does not see, what feels like everything coming against him, is actually God unfolding a plan to bring his family back together. So maybe when it feels like everything is against you, there's something that we just don't see yet. Now, we're not saying that we should not learn from past mistakes. Many of us would say we have benefited from past mistakes. We've learned from past mistakes. But when we have difficulty in the past, it can take two paths. Difficulty from the past can produce wisdom that moves you forward, or difficulty from the past can produce fear and anxiety that hold us back. And here's what can happen, church. I know we're going deep today. Sometimes we hold back or we hold others back, and it's out of fear, but we mislabel it as wisdom. It's just not wise to do this. A question that might bring clarity is, if you're pausing or you're not stepping forward, how close is the reason for pausing or not stepping forward? How close is that reason to the present situation? You see, there may have been good reason to not send Benjamin. Like if Benjamin was a toddler, it probably wouldn't be wise to send him on this trip, because remember, there's a famine. All the Taco Bells are closed. All the McDonald's, all the Jersey Mike's, all the Jimmy John's, they're all closed. Even Subway isn't open. They're all closed. So if Benjamin wasn't able to fend for himself because he was too young, it wouldn't be wise to send him. Or if Benjamin had a broken leg and couldn't walk the distance from Canaan to Egypt, it wouldn't be wise to send him. Or maybe if Benjamin was a terrible traveler, like he got car sick really bad, and if they sent him on the trip, he was going to be throwing up in the back seat from Canaan all the way to Egypt. Maybe it wouldn't be wise to send Benjamin on the road trip. But none of that is what's going on here. In fact, Benjamin was the youngest, so he may have been the strongest and actually the most capable of making the journey. The reason that Jacob holds Benjamin back has nothing to do with his ability to make the journey. Jacob holds Benjamin back because of his own unresolved pain and heartache. 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. You see, these character qualities, power, love, and self-discipline, these are character qualities of the Lord. So when we overcome fear by faith, the Lord invites us to join and share in his character qualities of love, of power, of self-control. And if we miss this, past pain can become an idol that holds greater influence over our decision-making than God. Fear has the potential to run our life, and that's not how God designed it. God wants to lead your life. But if we don't guard our heart, fear can run our life, and then we miss out on sharing in God's power, God's love, and God's self-control. So Jacob and the brothers, it gets to a point where they are dying of starvation. And yet Jacob is still resolute in refusing to send Benjamin. Genesis 42:38, Jacob replies, "My son will not go down with you." We're not sending Benjamin. His brother Joseph is dead, and he's all I have left. Benjamin is all I have left. If anything should happen to him, Benjamin, on your journey, you would send this grieving, white-haired man to the grave. This is an example of how fear can be so influential that it actually inhibits our ability to make rational decisions. And I wish that we could say that in the end, that it was faith that won the day in Jacob's life, and he finally had the faith to send Benjamin. He does send Benjamin, but it's not really a faith decision. It's just that one fear becomes greater than another fear, because everyone is starving to death. And so this is, you can tell me what you would do in this situation. Send Benjamin, and maybe Benjamin dies, or don't send Benjamin and everybody dies. Okay, I think I'm going to go with the option where we're going to try and save everybody's life, including Benjamin's. So Benjamin is finally released to go with the brothers. Now, as we get ready to finish today, when we're in these situations that cause fear, remember, fear is when we're confronted with something in the immediate and we have to make a choice. What we do is we make these calculations, right? We calculate, we self-calculate. Okay, if I step out in fear, if I step out in faith, these are the possible good outcomes that could happen, but also these are the potential bad outcomes, and we tend to focus on the bad outcomes. So Jacob is making these calculations that you and I would make in the same situation. I'm going to step out in fear, Jacob is thinking, and the best possible outcome is that all my sons survive, and also that we have enough food to make it through the famine. Remember, he hasn't heard the promise that it's only going to last 7 years, only like it's a long time. But he doesn't know how long it's going to last, but he's calculating, okay, if I release my sons, including Benjamin, the best possible outcome is that my family survives and that we have enough food to make it through the famine. So our calculations, though, our calculations can leave out God. Our calculations can leave out God. Because on the other side of Jacob finally sending Benjamin, there are outcomes that are far greater than Jacob had ever calculated. You see, the brothers, they go back and they bring Benjamin with them, and Joseph says, guys, don't you recognize me? It's me, it's your brother, Joseph. Joseph, it's you, it's amazing. I can't believe we did what we did to you, but you lived, and look at you, you're powerful now. And there was weeping, and there was hugging, and there was happiness and joy that they're all back together again. And remember, in Jacob's mind, he's making these calculations. The best possible outcome is enough food to make it through the famine, and my 11 remaining sons survive. But I want to show you that Jacob almost missed out on a plan for provision that was far greater than he could ever calculate, because he never calculated that his son Joseph was now the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. So when Pharaoh finds out that this is all of Joseph's family and that his dad is still alive back in Canaan, Genesis 45, 19 and 20, Pharaoh says to Joseph, tell your brothers, take the wagons from the land of Egypt to carry your little children and your wives, and bring your father here. Let's make this in 2023 terms. Send the motorcade, send the limousines, send the buses, send Air Force One. Bring dad here. Bring dad here. And I'm sure that their clothes are tattered and worn from all these years of famine. Tell them to only bring the clothes that they have on their back. Don't worry about your personal belongings, verse 20, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Bring them here and we'll take them to the mall, and they can have everything that they want. There's no way that Jacob could have calculated the provision that was on its way. Remember, we said two things would happen. One, that there would be provision beyond what Jacob could ever calculate, and also that there would be a restoration in Jacob's family beyond what Jacob thought possible. Why? Because Jacob thought it was impossible that he would ever see his son Joseph again. He was convinced that Joseph was dead, but he finds out that Joseph is alive, and now Jacob is even in fear at this moment to go forward, even after receiving word that his son Joseph is alive. Genesis 46, 3 and 4. God speaking to Jacob, I am God, the God of your father. Listen, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make your family into a great nation. I will go with you down to Egypt, and I will bring you back again. You will die in Egypt, but Joseph will be with you to close your eyes. On the other side of fear, what happens to Benjamin? Benjamin lives. What happens on the other side of fear? Jacob's family receives provision beyond what they could ever imagine. What happens on the other side of fear? Jacob is reunited with the son Joseph that he thought had died decades earlier. God has given us a healthy fear. God has wired us with a fear to react to dangerous situations. God has wired us with a fear to not stand in front of oncoming traffic. God has wired us with a healthy fear to not put our hand on a hot stove. But when it comes to the fear that can cultivate in our life, because the enemy wants to work against God's plans, God's provision, and God's purposes, God has so much better for us than just trying to live a life of avoiding fear. And I wonder if some of us have settled into that today, where Instead of facing fear by faith, we try to just avoid situations that cause fear. God has better for us than living to avoid fear. Rather, through God, we overcome fear by faith. In our closing moments together, I want to ask you a question. Is there a Benjamin in your life today? And I know some of you are like, name Benjamin. That's not what I'm talking about. But is there a Benjamin like Jacob had a Benjamin? Is there something or someone you are clinging to so tightly, but if you're honest, you'd say, I'm holding on to it and I've convinced myself that it's wisdom, but it's actually fear. You are driven by fear and you are holding on to whatever Benjamin represents, something or someone, and you're holding on to it so tightly, and you actually can see that it is potentially holding you back from God's promises, God's plans, or God's purposes. And maybe you've done all the calculations, like Jacob did all the calculations. You've calculated the best outcome, the worst outcome, and you've calculated. And maybe you have not taken into account that God sees a picture that is far broader than you see. And maybe, just maybe, he's leading you to step forward in faith, and he wants to do something that is far greater than anything that you could calculate on your own. As I was praying through the final preparations of this message and got to this closing part, it was laid on my heart, something specific that I believe is not for everybody, and it may just be for one person. And it may just be for one person who attends at any time in the morning. So I don't know if this is for someone who is here for first service, second service, or here in this gathering. But here is what the Lord laid on my heart, and this is a specific message. Someone who is here today or maybe watching online, you are in a dating or engaged relationship, and it is not a healthy relationship. It is not honoring the Lord. But you are staying in that relationship, and it is a fear that is keeping you there, and that fear that you have convinced yourself is that if I don't stay in this relationship, even though it's unhealthy, I'm fearing leaving this relationship because if I do, I won't find someone else. And you fear loneliness if you step away from this unhealthy relationship. But what the Lord wants you to hear today, to see today, is that that is not the relationship that the Lord has for you. And he wants you to step forward in boldness, to step away from that, because he has something and he has someone better for you than that relationship. And we pray for that other person, but it's not healthy for you to stay where you are. Okay, back to all of us. Remember Ava, the ice climber? So fearful to climb the ice mountain like a lot of us would be. But she said, I need to overcome this fear. And we're not talking primarily about ice climbing today, but it's representative. And there is something spiritual, there's a fear, and you have held back. And maybe today, whatever the ice mountain is, you're saying, I'm ready to climb it. I'm done making excuses. I'm done with all the reasons why not. And you're gonna go up to that sheet of ice and put one hand on, and then another hand, one foot, then another foot. I've never done that before, so I don't know how that all works, but one hand above another, one foot above another, one step at a time. The Lord is saying it's time to overcome. It's time to overcome. Today is the day to overcome fear by faith. And maybe you're saying, I tried that and it was all going very well, but like Ava, it was all going well until it wasn't, and then I crashed. And now you're in that place where you stepped out in fear by faith, and there was an accident or whatever it was, and you were left spiritually, emotionally, or physically wounded, and it has actually paralyzed you. And now you're not even thinking about climbing the ice wall anymore, but you can't even step across the frozen creek. And the Lord is saying, we're done standing on the sidelines today. You're missing out on what the Lord has for you as you stand on the side of the creek. And the Lord is saying it's time to take that step. And maybe you're the friend on the outside and it doesn't make sense. Why is that person so afraid? That step is so simple, but it seems simple because you don't know the story. And if you knew the story, you know why that step that seems so simple isn't so simple. And so maybe you're the friend and it's time to stop standing on the outside, questioning that person, and it's time to come alongside that person and help them to take that step. I don't want to miss out on what the Lord has for me. And I believe many of you would say the same thing. And it's time for us today to lay our fears at the feet of Jesus and to step forward with a boldness and faith that he sees what we don't see yet. And as we step out in faith, our fears will be overcome and we trust him for the outcome.